The sound of metal prosthetics hitting the concrete echoed through the empty warehouse. As Marcus Thompson wheeled himself toward the cage where 15-year-old Riley Chun sat curled in the corner, her sleeve-covered stumps wrapped protectively around her knees. The human traffickers had listed her as damaged goods, a price reduction they thought would attract buyers looking for cheap labor. They had no idea that the man rolling toward their operation had spent 3 tours in Afghanistan. Learning that broken things could be the strongest of all. What happened next would change both their lives forever, proving that sometimes the most unlikely partnerships create the most powerful families. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Marcus Thompson had been staring at the ceiling of his Denver apartment for exactly 4 hours and 17 minutes, counting the water stains that mapped out a geography of neglect across the yellowed plaster. The digital clock beside his bed glowed 3:43 a.m. in accusatory red numbers, marking another sleepless night in what had become an endless series of them. His legs, or rather, the space where his legs used to be, throbbed with phantom pain that no medication could touch. No therapy could cure. The eye that had taken his legs outside Kandahar 3 years ago had been hidden beneath a pile of children's toys. Marcus remembered that detail with crystalline clarity, along with the sound his sergeant had made when the blast threw him 30 feet into a concrete wall. The toys had been bright yellow and red, innocent plastic scattered across a roadway that would never be innocent again. Sometimes, in the deepest hours of night, Marcus wondered if the children who had played with those toys were still alive. Still whole, still able to run through streets without fear. The Purple Heart sat in a drawer somewhere, buried beneath unpaid bills and prescription bottles. The metal felt like mockery now, recognition for sacrifice that had left him less than he was before, struggling to find purpose in a world designed for people with working legs. The Veterans Affairs Office had processed his disability claim with bureaucratic efficiency, providing monthly checks that covered rent and groceries, but couldn't fill the hollow space where his sense of identity used to live. Marcus's apartment told the story of a man learning to navigate a world that had suddenly become impossibly complicated. Grab bars lined the bathroom walls, installed by a well-meaning volunteer from the local VFW chapter. His kitchen counters had been lowered to wheelchair height, creating an odd landscape where everything felt miniaturized, childlike. The refrigerator was stocked with frozen dinners and energy drinks, the diet of someone who had given up on the ritual of cooking for himself. The silence in apartment 4B was different from the silence he had known in the desert. Military silence had purpose. Tension, the electric anticipation of action. This silence was empty, purposeless, broken only by the hum of the air conditioning unit and the occasional argument from his neighbors in 4C. Marcus had learned to identify the rhythm of their fights, the man's voice rising to a crescendo, the woman's pleading responses, the inevitable crash of something being thrown against their shared wall. Physical therapy had ended 6 months ago when Marcus stopped showing up for appointments. The therapists were kind, professional, relentlessly optimistic about his potential for adaptation and independence. They spoke in measured tones about acceptance, adjustment, building new routines around his modified capabilities. But Marcus had reached his own conclusion. Some losses were too fundamental to overcome. Some breaks couldn't be healed, only endured. Prosthetics sat in his closet like expensive promises he couldn't keep. The VA had provided state-of-the-art equipment, titanium and carbon fiber legs that cost more than most people's cars. The prosthetist, a cheerful woman named Dr. Sarah Martinez, had explained the technology with genuine enthusiasm. These weren't just artificial limbs, she said. They were precision instruments designed to restore mobility and confidence. Marcus had tried them exactly 7 times before deciding that strapping metal to his stumps felt like wearing someone else's bones. His days had developed a rhythm that felt less like living than like waiting. Morning brought coffee and the news, delivered through a laptop screen that showed him a world continuing to turn without his participation. Afternoon meant responding to check-in calls from his sister Jennifer, who lived in Portland and worried about him with the persistent anxiety of someone who loved him but didn't know how to help. Evening was reserved for the bottle of whiskey that helped blur the edges of phantom pain and sharper memories. The apartment complex where Marcus lived, Riverside Gardens, was a collection of low-income housing units built in the 1980s and maintained with the minimal effort required to avoid condemnation. The gardens referenced in the name existed only in the optimistic imagination of whatever developer had named the place. Instead of greenery, the complex featured cracked asphalt, overflowing dumpsters, and a playground where broken swings hung like question marks against the Denver sky. Marcus's neighbors were a mixture of elderly residents living on fixed incomes, single mothers working multiple jobs, and people like himself, veterans, divorcees, and others who had found themselves suddenly needing affordable housing. The woman in 2A, Mrs. Elizabeth Rodriguez, had lost her husband in Vietnam and understood something about the weight of empty spaces. She occasionally left homemade tamales outside Marcus's door, acts of kindness that he accepted with grateful awkwardness. The closest thing Marcus had to a routine involved his weekly trip to the VA hospital for prescription refills and mandatory counseling sessions with Dr. Michael Foster, a psychiatrist who specialized in combat trauma. Dr. Foster was younger than Marcus, had never served in the military, and approached therapy with the earnest determination of someone who believed that talking could heal anything. Their sessions felt like elaborate dances around the truth that some wounds were too deep for words to reach. "Marcus," Dr. Foster had said during their last session, "you're isolating yourself. Depression thrives in isolation. Have you considered volunteer work? Sometimes helping others can help us rediscover our own sense of purpose." The suggestion had annoyed Marcus more than usual. Dr. Foster's office was decorated with inspirational posters featuring mountain climbers and marathon runners, people whose bodies responded to their commands, whose limitations were temporary obstacles rather than permanent realities. The idea that Marcus should find purpose in helping others felt like being asked to give directions to a place he'd never been, but the conversation had planted a seed of restlessness that grew over the following days. Marcus found himself thinking about purpose, about the version of himself that had existed before the IED, that Marcus had been a staff sergeant who took care of his soldiers, who solved problems, who made decisions that mattered. The man who remained felt like a shadow of that person, operating equipment designed for someone else's life. The disability check arrived on the 1st of every month, direct deposited into an account that Marcus rarely accessed except to pay bills. The money felt like compensation for a transaction he hadn't agreed to. His legs and his identity traded for enough cash to survive, but not enough to thrive. Sometimes he wondered what his fallen brothers would think of his current existence. Would they understand the paralysis that went beyond his missing limbs? Would they recognize the warrior they had served beside in the man who now struggled to find reasons to get out of bed? Denver's summer heat made the apartment feel like a concrete oven, despite the air conditioning unit that ran constantly and accomplished little. Marcus had developed a habit of sitting by his window during the hottest part of the day, watching the heat shimmer rise from the parking lot like ghosts. Children from the complex played outside despite the temperature, their laughter carrying through his thin windows with the persistence of life asserting itself against all obstacles. One particular afternoon, Marcus watched a group of kids playing basketball on a court where the net had long since rotted away. The game was chaotic, joyful, completely unconcerned with official rules or proper equipment. A girl who couldn't have been more than 8 was holding her own against boys twice her size, using speed and determination to compensate for her smaller stature. Marcus found himself absorbed in her strategy, the way she adapted her approach to overcome obvious disadvantages. The girl reminded him of something Dr. Foster had mentioned during one of their sessions, the concept of post-traumatic growth. The idea that trauma could sometimes lead to strength that wouldn't have existed otherwise. Marcus had dismissed the theory at the time, but watching the child play with fierce joy despite every disadvantage made him wonder if there might be something to the idea of finding power in places where others saw only limitation. That night, Marcus did something he hadn't done in months. He researched volunteer opportunities online. The VA website listed dozens of programs designed to help veterans find meaningful ways to contribute to their communities. Most of them felt artificial, designed by people who had never experienced the particular emptiness that came with sudden permanent disability. But buried in the list was something that caught his attention, a program called Second Chances, which worked to rescue victims of human trafficking. The program description was brief, clinical, focused on the practical aspects of providing safe housing and support services for rescued individuals. But something about the mission resonated with Marcus in a way he couldn't immediately articulate. Perhaps it was the recognition that trafficking victims, like combat veterans, knew something about having their choices stripped away, about surviving situations that permanently changed how they saw the world. Marcus bookmarked the website and closed his laptop, feeling something that might have been curiosity stirring for the first time in months. The sensation was unfamiliar after so much numbness, like circulation returning to a limb that had fallen asleep. He wasn't ready to make any commitments, wasn't sure he had anything meaningful to offer people whose trauma was different from but parallel to his own. But for the first time since the explosion in Kandahar, Marcus Thompson felt the faintest possibility that his story might not be over, that the man he had become might be capable of something more than just surviving, more than just counting water stains on a ceiling while the world continued without him. The thought was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure, like standing at the edge of a cliff and realizing you might actually have wings. Outside his window, the city of Denver settled into another evening, unaware that in apartment 4B of Riverside Gardens, a war veteran was taking the first tentative steps toward discovering that sometimes the most broken people are exactly what the world needs most. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Riley Chun had been invisible for so long that she had almost forgotten what it felt like to be seen. In the basement of the warehouse on the outskirts of Denver, invisibility was survival. The concrete walls absorbed sound and hope in equal measure, creating a tomb where 37 people existed in various states of captivity, each carrying stories of how they had arrived in this hell disguised as an industrial building. At 15, Riley was older than most of the other children, which made her both protector and target in the complex hierarchy that emerged in places where humanity was treated as commodity. The traffickers who controlled their lives operated with business-like efficiency, viewing their captives through the cold lens of profit margins and market demand. Children were sorted by age, appearance, and what the captors euphemistically called special characteristics. Riley's missing arms placed her firmly in the category they labeled damaged goods. The arms had been gone since birth, a condition called bilateral amelia that occurred in fewer than 1 in 100,000 births. Riley's biological parents, overwhelmed teenage immigrants who could barely support themselves, had surrendered her to the foster care system when she was 3 days old. The note they left with her, written in broken English on the back of a fast food receipt, simply said, "We cannot give her what she needs. Please find someone who can love her anyway." Riley had bounced through 17 different foster homes in her first 14 years of life. Some placements lasted months, others barely lasted weeks. The common thread was always the same: families who thought they were prepared for a child with disabilities, but discovered that Good intentions weren't enough to bridge the gap between expectation and reality. Foster parents would speak about her in the third person while she sat in the same room, discussing her limitations and special needs, as if her hearing had been affected along with her arms. The group home where Riley had lived immediately before her kidnapping was called Sunnydale Children's Center. Though there was nothing sunny about the institutional building that housed 43 kids aging out of the foster system. The staff were overworked and underpaid, managing caseloads that made individual attention impossible. Riley had learned to navigate the environment by becoming useful in ways that didn't require traditional physical capabilities. She could mediate conflicts between younger children, help with homework using her remarkable memory, and create elaborate stories that transported listeners away from their circumstances. But it was Riley's art that truly set her apart. Unable to use her hands, she had taught herself to draw and paint using her feet with a precision that astonished everyone who witnessed it. Her right foot could manipulate a pencil or paintbrush with the delicacy of a surgeon, creating detailed portraits and landscapes that seemed impossible given her physical constraints. The art teacher at her last school, Mrs. Patricia Williams, had called Riley's work transcendent, explaining that great art came from places of deep emotion rather than technical perfection. Riley's artistic ability had, ironically, made her a target for the traffickers who eventually took her. One of her paintings, a haunting portrait of a girl reaching toward a door that was always just out of grasp, had been displayed in a local coffee shop as part of a fundraiser for Sunnydale. The painting had caught the attention of someone who understood that unique talents could be exploited in ways that went beyond traditional forms of trafficking. The kidnapping had happened on a Tuesday evening in March as Riley walked back to Sunnydale from her weekly art therapy session at the community center. 3 people in a van had approached her under the pretense of asking for directions, then forced her inside with the practiced efficiency of people who had done this before. The entire incident took less than 30 seconds, witnessed only by a homeless man who was too intoxicated to provide a reliable account to police. In the warehouse, Riley discovered that traffickers had developed specialized markets for people with disabilities. There were buyers who sought out individuals with specific physical differences, viewing them as exotic commodities rather than human beings. The revelation had been more devastating than the physical conditions of captivity, because it meant that even her disability, which had already cost her so much, could be weaponized against her. The other children in the warehouse came from dozens of different backgrounds, but they shared the common experience of having been discarded by systems that were supposed to protect them. Maria Santos, 12 years old and fluent in 3 languages, had been taken from a bus stop while trying to find her way to a relative's house after aging out of care. Jeremy Washington, 10 years old and small for his age, had disappeared from a playground while his overwhelmed single mother worked a double shift at a nearby factory. Riley had appointed herself as an unofficial guardian for the younger children, using her storytelling abilities to help them escape mentally when physical escape was impossible. She would create elaborate tales about brave children who overcame impossible odds, about families who were searching tirelessly for their missing members, about heroes who specialized in rescuing people who had been forgotten by the world. Stories weren't just entertainment. They were acts of resistance against the dehumanization that surrounded them daily. The traffickers operated their business with the bureaucratic mundanity of any other commercial enterprise. They maintained detailed records of their inventory, tracking ages, physical characteristics, and what they called market appeal. Riley's file, which she had glimpsed during one of the processing sessions, listed her as Asian female, 15 years, bilateral upper limb deficiency, artistic abilities, reduced price due to physical limitations. The reduced price designation had initially felt like another rejection, another confirmation that she was somehow less valuable than other people. But over time, Riley began to understand that being considered damaged goods might actually be her salvation. The lower price point meant she was more likely to be purchased by someone with limited resources rather than wealthy buyers who could afford premium merchandise. There was a chance, however slim, that her purchaser might be someone looking for cheap labor rather than something more sinister. Riley had used her art as a form of psychological survival throughout her captivity. Without access to traditional materials, she had learned to create mental drawings, visualizing complex compositions in detail and then storing them in her memory. Like a gallery she could visit whenever reality became unbearable, she drew portraits of the other children, landscapes from dreams of freedom, and abstract representations of emotions too complex for words. One drawing that she returned to repeatedly in her mind was of a door, not the door from her coffee shop painting, but a different one. This door was open, flooded with light, with a figure standing in the doorway extending a hand towards someone in darkness. Riley couldn't see the face of the figure in her mental drawing, but she had given him specific characteristics: strong shoulders that suggested someone who could carry heavy burdens, eyes that had seen difficult things but hadn't become cruel, hands that moved gently despite being attached to someone who understood violence. The warehouse operated on a schedule that seemed designed to break down any sense of normal time. Meals came irregularly, consisting of cheap processed food that provided calories but little nutrition. Sleep was communal, taking place on thin mattresses arranged on the concrete floor. Privacy was non-existent. Dignity was a luxury none of them could afford, and hope was rationed like medicine that might run out if used too freely. But Riley had discovered something unexpected in the depths of that place: the recognition that survival itself was a form of defiance. Every day she continued to exist. Every story she told to comfort frightened children, every mental drawing she created, was a refusal to be completely broken by circumstances designed to destroy her humanity. She had learned in foster care that resilience wasn't about being strong enough to never break. It was about finding ways to keep functioning even after breaking had occurred. The traffickers had tried to determine Riley's street value through a series of degrading assessments that reduced her to a collection of marketable characteristics. But they had completely missed what made her truly valuable: her capacity to create beauty in the midst of horror, to offer comfort when she herself was suffering, to maintain hope in circumstances specifically designed to extinguish it. These qualities couldn't be listed on an inventory sheet or factored into a price calculation, but they were what would ultimately determine her fate. On the day everything changed, Riley was teaching 8-year-old Sophia how to braid friendship bracelets, using only their feet when the sound of heavy footsteps echoed through the warehouse. New buyers arrived regularly, usually middle-aged men who moved through the space like they were shopping for furniture, examining merchandise with clinical detachment. But this time was different. This time, Riley heard something that made her heart race with a mixture of terror and impossible hope: the distinctive sound of metal prosthetics hitting concrete. The sound was rhythmic, purposeful, accompanied by the whisper of wheelchair wheels. Someone was coming who moved differently than the usual buyers, someone whose body told a story of its own. Riley couldn't see the entrance from where she sat, but she could hear voices, the traffickers speaking in the obsequious tones they used with customers, and another voice responding with questions that seemed focused on something other than the usual selection criteria. As the voices grew closer, Riley found herself holding her breath, creating a final mental drawing: a warrior on wheels, carrying light into darkness, searching for something specific among the forgotten and discarded. She didn't know why, but something told her that this buyer was different, that the sound of metal on concrete might be the sound of rescue disguised as transaction. The footsteps stopped just outside the area where the children waited, and Riley prepared herself to meet whatever came next, drawing strength from all the stories she had told about heroes who specialized in saving people the world had left behind. Marcus Thompson had been working with the Second Chances organization for exactly 6 weeks when Detective Angela Morrison called him with the kind of opportunity that made his military training kick in despite his civilian status. The human trafficking ring they'd been tracking for months was finally ready to make a move, and they needed someone who could pose as a buyer without raising suspicion. Marcus, Detective Morrison had said during their encrypted phone call, "We've identified a warehouse operation on the east side. Intelligence suggests they're holding at least 30 victims, including several children. We need someone who can get inside, assess the situation, and help us coordinate a rescue operation." The detective's voice carried the weight of someone who had seen too much of humanity's darkest corners. Angela Morrison was a 15-year veteran of Denver PD's Human Trafficking Task Force, a woman who had built her career around the principle that every victim deserved someone willing to fight for their freedom. She had approached Marcus through the Second Chances program after hearing about his unique combination of military experience and personal understanding of what it meant to be discarded by systems that were supposed to care. Marcus had spent the previous month learning about the trafficking industry with the same methodical approach he had once used to study enemy tactics in Afghanistan. The scope of the problem was staggering. Hundreds of thousands of people bought and sold annually. In the United States alone, with children representing a significant percentage of victims. The traffickers operated sophisticated networks that moved people like inventory, using technology and logistics that would have impressed Fortune 500 companies if applied to legitimate business. The operation they were targeting had been on law enforcement's radar for 8 months, ever since a victim had escaped and provided detailed information about the warehouse location and internal structure. The escapee, a 19-year-old woman named Catherine Rodriguez, had given authorities enough intelligence to begin building a case, but they needed someone on the inside to confirm current conditions and identify all potential victims before attempting a rescue. Marcus's disability made him an ideal undercover operative for the specific mission. Traffickers were accustomed to buyers with various quirks and preferences. A veteran in a wheelchair wouldn't necessarily raise suspicions, especially if he presented himself as someone looking for domestic help rather than more sinister purposes. His military background also meant he could assess security measures, identify exit routes, and evaluate tactical considerations that civilian volunteers might miss. The preparation for the mission had been intense and emotionally difficult. Marcus had to create a believable backstory that explained his interest in purchasing a trafficking victim while maintaining the psychological distance necessary to function effectively undercover. He posed as Robert Matthews, a disabled veteran who had inherited money from a deceased relative and was looking for live-in assistance that traditional employment agencies couldn't provide. Detective Morrison had briefed him extensively on what to expect inside the warehouse. The traffickers typically allowed potential buyers to view available merchandise in a showroom-style setting, with victims displayed like products in a catalog. The process was designed to dehumanize both victims and buyers, reducing complex human beings to simple transactions based on age, appearance, and specific capabilities or limitations. Marcus, Detective Morrison had warned him during their final briefing, "What you're going to see in there will stay with you forever. These people have been through hell, and some of them may not survive this psychological trauma, even if we rescue them successfully. Your job is to gather intelligence and identify targets for extraction, not to be a hero. We'll have tactical teams positioned around the building, but your safety depends on maintaining your cover until we give the signal." The warehouse was located in an industrial district that had been declining for decades, surrounded by abandoned factories and chemical plants that provided perfect cover for illegal activities. Marcus had driven past the building twice during daylight hours, noting security cameras, guard positions, and potential escape routes. The structure was a concrete fortress with minimal windows and only 2 visible entrances, designed more like a prison than a commercial facility. On the day of the operation, Marcus approached the warehouse in a modified van that could accommodate his wheelchair, carrying a briefcase filled with cash that Detective Morrison's department had provided for the undercover purchase. His heart rate was elevated, but his hands were steady, the same physiological response he had experienced before combat missions in Afghanistan. The familiar sensation was almost comforting, a reminder that some skills translated across contexts. Even when everything else had changed, the initial contact was made through a man who introduced himself only as Carl, a middle-aged individual with the dead eyes of someone who had stopped viewing other people as fully human. Carl examined Marcus's identification and cash with professional efficiency, asking pointed questions about his specific requirements and budget limitations. The conversation felt like buying a car, complete with discussions of features, warranties, and return policies. "What exactly are you looking for?" Carl had asked, leading Marcus through a series of security doors that required electronic keycards. "We've got a good selection right now, various ages and backgrounds. Some are more suited to household work. Others have specialized skills that might interest someone with particular needs." Marcus had explained that he needed live-in assistance with cooking, cleaning, and personal care, tasks that required someone who could be trained specifically for his disability-related needs. He emphasized that he was looking for someone older, more mature, who could handle the psychological demands of working with a veteran dealing with PTSD and physical limitations. The warehouse interior was exactly as horrific as Detective Morrison had prepared him to expect, but intellectual preparation couldn't blunt the emotional impact of seeing dozens of people reduced to merchandise. The victims were housed in different sections, based on demographics and perceived market value, with children separated from adults and males separated from females. The organization was methodical, businesslike, and absolutely chilling in its efficiency. Carl had led Marcus through the various sections, providing commentary on different victims like a tour guide in a museum of human misery. The man's casual demeanor while discussing the trafficking of children and adults revealed a level of moral detachment that Marcus found more disturbing than outright cruelty. This wasn't evil driven by passion or rage. This was evil as routine. Business practice. "Over here we have our premium inventory," Carl had explained, gesturing toward a group of young women who avoided eye contact with potential buyers. All between 18 and 25, various ethnic backgrounds, most with some education or special skills. Price range is typically $15,000 to $30,000, depending on specific characteristics and negotiated terms. Marcus had nodded and asked appropriate questions while internally cataloging faces, approximate ages, and visible signs of physical abuse or medical needs. His military training and intelligence gathering served him well, allowing him to compartmentalize his emotional responses while collecting the information that would be crucial for the rescue operation. The section containing children was the most difficult part of the reconnaissance mission. Marcus had to force himself to maintain his cover while observing kids who reminded him of his own nieces and nephews, children who should have been in school or playing in parks instead of being sold to the highest bidder. The traffickers had developed specialized sales pitches for different types of child victims, emphasizing qualities like obedience, trainability, and discretion. It was in the children's section that Marcus first saw Riley Chun, though he didn't know her name at the time. She was sitting in a corner with several younger children clustered around her, and even from a distance, Marcus could see that she was different from the other victims. While most of the captives displayed the broken body language of people who had given up hope, Riley sat with her back straight, her attention focused on the children around her rather than on the potential buyers touring the facility. "That one's interesting," Carl had said, noticing Marcus's attention. 15 years old, Asian bilateral upper limb deficiency. Artistic abilities, supposedly, though I can't say I see the practical application. She's listed at 8,000. Marked down because of the physical limitations. might work for your situation if you're looking for someone who couldn't run away easily. The casual cruelty of the comment hit Marcus like a physical blow, but he maintained his composure and expressed interest in learning more. Carl explained that Riley had been in their inventory for several weeks and was becoming a financial liability because of reduced market interest. The traffickers were motivated to move her quickly, which meant Marcus could potentially negotiate an even lower price. As they approached Riley's area, Marcus found himself making eye contact with her for the first time. What he saw in her gaze wasn't the hopelessness he had observed in other victims, but something that reminded him of soldiers he had served with, people who had been through hell, but hadn't surrendered their essential humanity. Riley looked at him with curiosity rather than fear, as if she was trying to determine what kind of person he really was beneath his buyer's disguise. The moment of connection lasted only seconds, but it changed something fundamental in Marcus's understanding of his mission. This wasn't just about gathering intelligence for a rescue operation. This was about a specific human being who had somehow maintained her dignity and strength despite circumstances designed to break her completely. Riley Chun wasn't just another victim to be cataloged and rescued. She was someone who reminded Marcus of the warrior he used to be, someone whose survival was itself an act of defiance. "I'd like to make an offer," Marcus had told Carl, his voice steady despite the emotional storm raging inside him. 8,000 for the girl, cash, immediate transaction. Carl had smiled with the satisfaction of someone closing an unexpected deal. "Excellent choice. She's low maintenance, won't give you trouble, and the price point leaves room in your budget for additional purchases if you're interested." As the paperwork was being processed, Marcus caught Riley's eye one more time and saw something that might have been recognition pass across her features. Somehow, this 15-year-old girl seemed to understand that the transaction unfolding around her wasn't what it appeared to be, that the man in the wheelchair might be something other than just another buyer in a marketplace of human suffering. Rescue operation would begin in exactly 4 hours. But Marcus Thompson had already found what he didn't know he was looking for. Someone whose brokenness matched his own. Someone who had learned to create light in places where hope wasn't supposed to exist. Someone who would teach him that being whole had nothing to do with having all your original parts. The tactical breach of the warehouse began at exactly 11:47 p.m., coordinated with military precision that Marcus recognized from his own service days. Detective Morrison's team had positioned snipers on surrounding buildings, blocked all exit routes, and cut power to the facility's security systems before the first flashbang grenade shattered the industrial silence. The operation unfolded with the controlled chaos of professionals who had rehearsed every possible scenario. Marcus had been extracted from the warehouse 30 minutes before the raid, ostensibly to complete paperwork at an off-site location. Carl and his associates had no idea that their newest customer was currently sitting in an unmarked police van 3 blocks away, wearing a Kevlar vest and coordinating the final details of their destruction. The irony wasn't lost on Marcus that he was once again participating in a military-style operation, except this time the enemy was trafficking American children instead of insurgents in Afghanistan. The first wave of officers entered through the main entrance while a second team breached the loading dock simultaneously. Marcus listened to the tactical communications through his headset, hearing the methodical progression as teams secured different sections of the building. Section A. Clear, 6 victims secured. Section B clear, moving to secure evidence. Medical team standing by for trauma assessment. Riley Chun was found exactly where Marcus had last seen her, sitting in the corner with the younger children clustered around her like chicks, seeking protection from a mother hen. When the tactical officers burst into her section with their weapons drawn and tactical gear making them look like armored aliens, Riley's first instinct was to shield the children behind her, using her body as a barrier despite having no arms to physically protect them. Officer Sandra Kim, a specialist in child Victim extraction approached Riley with the careful movements of someone trained to work with traumatized individuals. Sandra was a second-generation Korean American who spoke fluent English and basic Mandarin, skills that proved invaluable when communicating with victims from diverse backgrounds. Her gear was deliberately less intimidating than the tactical. Officers, no weapons visible, softer body armor, and a voice trained to project calm authority rather than aggressive dominance. Riley, Sandra had said, using the name that Detective Morrison's intelligence had provided. "My name is Officer Kim. You're safe now. We're here to get you and the other children out of this place." Riley's response surprised everyone within earshot. Instead of relief or gratitude, her first question was about the man in the wheelchair who had purchased her hours earlier. "Where is he?" she asked, her voice hoarse from weeks of minimal speaking. "The man who bought me, is he safe? Did they hurt him for helping you?" The question revealed something that the rescue team hadn't anticipated. Riley had somehow understood that Marcus was working with law enforcement, despite his perfect maintenance of cover during their brief interaction. Her concern for his safety, expressed before any concern for her own welfare, demonstrated the kind of selfless thinking that Marcus himself would recognize as characteristic of soldiers who put mission and team before personal considerations. Sandra Kim had been briefed on Marcus's role in the operation, but she hadn't expected a victim to immediately identify him as law enforcement. "He's safe," she assured Riley. "He's one of the good guys working with us to help people like you. But right now, we need to focus on getting you medical attention and making sure you're okay." The medical assessment that followed was conducted in an ambulance parked outside the warehouse, away from the crime scene chaos but close enough for immediate evacuation if needed. Dr. Rachel Thompson, a pediatric emergency medicine specialist who volunteered with trafficking victim recovery programs, conducted a preliminary examination that focused as much on psychological trauma as physical injuries. Riley's physical condition was better than many trafficking victims, largely because her disability had protected her from certain forms of abuse that other captives had endured. But Dr. Thompson identified signs of malnutrition, sleep deprivation, and chronic stress that would require ongoing medical attention. More concerning were the psychological indicators: hypervigilance, emotional numbing, and a tendency to minimize her own needs while focusing on others' welfare. "Riley," Dr. Thompson had said gently, "I know this is overwhelming, but I need to ask you some questions about your health and what you've experienced. Everything you tell me is confidential, and it will help us make sure you get the care you need." Riley's responses to the medical interview revealed a remarkably mature understanding of her situation and a level of psychological resilience that impressed the entire medical team. She answered questions directly and honestly, without the evasiveness or trauma-induced confusion that often characterized trafficking victims immediately after rescue. Her primary concerns remained focused on the welfare of the other children who had been rescued, particularly the younger ones who had looked to her for protection during captivity. The temporary shelter where Riley was taken for initial processing was a converted community center that had been transformed into a crisis response facility. The space included medical examination rooms, counseling offices, and dormitory-style sleeping areas designed to provide immediate safety while longer-term placements were arranged. The facility was staffed by a multidisciplinary team, including social workers, medical professionals, legal advocates, and trauma counselors. Marcus arrived at the shelter 6 hours after the raid, still wearing the tactical vest that Detective Morrison had insisted he keep on until the entire operation was officially concluded. He had spent the intervening time being debriefed by federal agents who were building cases against the trafficking network, providing detailed accounts of everything he had observed during his undercover mission. The information he provided would eventually lead to arrests across 3 states and the identification of additional trafficking operations, The reunion between Marcus and Riley took place in a conference room that had been set up to feel more like a living room than an institutional space. Social worker Jennifer Martinez, who specialized in placement of disabled children in foster care, had arranged comfortable seating and made sure that both Marcus and Riley understood that this meeting was voluntary and could be ended at any time by either party. "Riley," Jennifer had begun, "this is Marcus Thompson, the man who helped law enforcement rescue you and the other children. He wanted to meet with you to make sure you're okay and to discuss what happens next." Riley looked at Marcus with the same penetrating gaze he remembered from the warehouse, but now her expression carried curiosity rather than the guarded assessment of potential threat. She studied his wheelchair, his prosthetics, and his face with the attention of an artist cataloging details for a future drawing. When she spoke, her first words were characteristically unexpected. "Thank you for not being what you pretended to be," she said simply. "I knew you were different when you looked at me like I was a person instead of a thing." The statement hit Marcus with unexpected emotional force. Throughout his military service and his struggle with disability, he had prided himself on his ability to read people accurately, to distinguish between genuine character and surface presentation. But Riley, despite being 15 years old and having endured weeks of dehumanizing captivity, had seen through his deception immediately and recognized something authentic beneath his cover identity. "How did you know?" Marcus asked, genuinely curious about her insight. Riley considered the question carefully before answering. "Most of the buyers looked at us like we were cars they might purchase, checking for damage, calculating value, thinking about how we could be useful to them. But you looked at me like you recognized something, like you understood what it felt like to be seen as broken when you're actually just different." The conversation continued for over an hour, covering topics that ranged from Riley's artistic abilities to Marcus's military service to their shared experience of navigating a world designed for people with different physical capabilities. Jennifer Martinez observed their interaction with growing amazement at the natural rapport developing between two people who had every reason to be cautious about trusting others. Riley described her art in detail, explaining how she had learned to adapt traditional techniques to work with her feet instead of hands. She spoke about the mental drawings she created during captivity, the stories she told to comfort younger children, and her dreams of someday attending art school if she could find a way to afford it. Her passion for creativity was evident in every word, and Marcus found himself thinking about the scholarship programs he had researched but never pursued for himself. Marcus shared his own story more openly than he had with any therapist or counselor since his injury. He talked about the challenges of adjusting to life with prosthetics, the isolation that came with disability, and his discovery that helping others had become a way of finding purpose after losing his original sense of identity. Riley listened with the focused attention of someone who understood that stories of overcoming adversity were precious gifts to be treasured rather than casual conversation. The most significant moment of their meeting came when Riley asked if she could see Marcus's prosthetics. He removed the titanium legs with some awkwardness, explaining the technology and engineering that went into creating artificial limbs that could support his weight and mobility. Riley examined them with fascination, running her foot along the metal and asking detailed questions about how they attached and functioned. "It's like we're both cyborgs," Riley said with a smile that transformed her entire face. "You have robot legs, and I have super feet that can do things most people's hands can't do. Maybe being different isn't the same as being broken." The observation was delivered with teenage matter-of-factness, but it contained a wisdom that struck Marcus as profoundly true. For months, he had focused on what he had lost rather than what he had gained through his experiences. Riley's perspective offered a different framework for understanding disability, not as absence or limitation, but as adaptation and uniqueness. As their meeting concluded, Jennifer Martinez discussed the immediate practical concerns related to Riley's placement. At 15, she was too old for traditional adoption, but too young for independent living. The foster care system had limited options for teenagers with disabilities, and Riley's lack of family connections made her placement particularly challenging. She would likely spend the next 3 years aging out of care in group homes or temporary placements, with minimal support for pursuing her educational or artistic goals. Marcus found himself asking questions about the process of becoming a foster parent, about the requirements and procedures for providing long-term care for teenagers in the system. Jennifer explained that single men rarely qualified as foster parents for teenage girls, and that his disability would likely be viewed as an additional barrier by placement agencies, focused on minimizing risk rather than maximizing potential. As Marcus looked at Riley, who was sketching his prosthetics from memory using a pencil held between her toes, he began to understand that some families weren't created through traditional channels. Some connections transcended conventional definitions of normal or appropriate or safe. Some healing happened when broken people found each other and discovered that their combined wholeness was stronger than either could achieve alone. Foundation for everything that would follow was laid in that converted conference room where a war veteran with no legs and a trafficking survivor with no arms began to understand that they might be exactly what each other needed to become complete. The Colorado Department of Human Services building on East 8th Avenue looked like every other government facility Marcus had ever encountered: sterile, underfunded, and designed to process people rather than help them. 3 weeks after Riley's rescue, he found himself sitting in a plastic chair that was too small for his frame, waiting to meet with caseworker Patricia Williams about what the state called alternative placement options for teenage trafficking survivors. Marcus had spent those 3 weeks learning more about the foster care system than he ever wanted to know. The statistics were devastating. Children who aged out of care had a 50% chance of becoming homeless within 2 years, a 25% chance of experiencing PTSD symptoms comparable to war veterans, and less than 3% chance of earning a college degree. For children with disabilities, the numbers were even worse. For trafficking survivors, the data was so grim that most agencies stopped tracking outcomes after the first year. Riley had been placed in Clearwater Residential Facility, a group home for older foster children that specialized in transitional living skills, bureaucratic language for teaching kids how to survive on their own when the state stopped caring for them at 18. Marcus had visited twice, each time leaving with a deeper understanding of why Riley referred to the place as minimum security prison with homework requirements. Clearwater housed 23 teenagers between the ages of 14 and 18, supervised by a rotating staff of overworked and underpaid social workers who were responsible for caseloads that made individual attention impossible. The facility was clean, safe, and thoroughly institutional in the way that places become when human needs are reduced to regulatory compliance and budget line items. Riley's room was a 10 by 12 space she shared with another girl, furnished with 2 beds, 2 dressers, and a desk that couldn't accommodate her unique way of writing and drawing. Patricia Williams turned out to be a woman in her 50s who had been working in child welfare for over 20 years. Her office walls were covered with thank you cards from former clients, artwork from children she had helped place, and photographs that told the story of a career spent fighting for kids that most people preferred to ignore. When she spoke about Riley's case, her voice carried the weight of someone who had seen too many good kids slip through cracks in systems that were supposed to catch them. "Mr. Thompson," Patricia had begun, consulting a file that seemed impossibly thick for someone Riley's age, "I understand you've developed a personal interest in Riley Chun's placement. I have to tell you that her situation is particularly challenging, even by our standards." Marcus had prepared for this conversation by researching every aspect of foster care law, disability rights, and trauma-informed care practices. He understood that his request to become Riley's foster parent was unconventional, potentially problematic, and likely to be rejected by multiple levels of bureaucracy. But he also understood that Riley was running out of time and options. "I've reviewed the requirements for emergency foster placement," Marcus replied, presenting a folder of documentation he had assembled. "I have stable housing, adequate income, clean background checks, and I've completed the required training courses. I understand that my disability raises questions, but I believe my experience with adaptive living actually qualifies me to help someone in Riley's situation." Patricia reviewed his paperwork with the thorough attention of someone who had learned that details mattered in a system where children's lives hung in the balance of properly completed forms. Marcus's military service record, his work with Second Chances, his financial statements, and his housing situation all met or exceeded the state's minimum requirements for foster placement. The complicating factor wasn't his qualifications. It was the unprecedented nature of his request. "Mr. Thompson," Patricia said carefully, "in 20 years of placement work, I've never had a single male apply to foster a teenage girl who wasn't a relative. The liability concerns alone make this extremely complicated. Add your disability and Riley's disability, and you're asking us to approve a placement that violates multiple guidelines designed to protect both children and foster parents." The conversation continued for over an hour, covering legal precedents, risk assessments, and the practical challenges of placing a 15-year-old trafficking survivor with a disabled veteran who had no previous experience with child care. Patricia was sympathetic but realistic about the bureaucratic obstacles that would need to be overcome. The state's primary concern was minimizing risk, not maximizing potential outcomes for children who had already been failed by multiple systems. But Patricia also revealed something that changed Marcus's understanding of the situation entirely. Riley had been asking about him daily since her placement at Clearwater, wanting to know if he was safe, if he was recovering from the undercover operation, and if he would be allowed to visit her again. More significantly, Riley had been creating art pieces inspired by their conversation, using her unique artistic abilities to process her experience of being rescued by someone who understood what it meant to navigate the world with a disability. "She drew this yesterday," Patricia said, showing Marcus a detailed pencil sketch that Riley had created using her feet. The drawing depicted two figures, one in a wheelchair, one standing, but their shadows on the ground showed them as complete whole people walking side by side. The artistic technique was remarkable, but the emotional content was what took Marcus's breath away. Riley had somehow captured the essence of their connection in ways that words couldn't express. The bureaucratic process that followed was a masterclass in institutional dysfunction. Marcus's application to become a foster parent required approval from multiple departments, each with different criteria and timelines. The Department of Human Services needed to verify his housing situation. The Department of Health required medical clearances for both him and Riley. The local police conducted additional background checks beyond what had been required for his work with Second Chances. Each department operated independently, with minimal communication between agencies. Marcus found himself repeating the same information to different caseworkers, submitting identical documentation to multiple offices, and waiting for approvals that seemed to exist in bureaucratic limbo. The process was designed to be thorough, but it had evolved into something that prioritized procedure over outcomes. Meanwhile, Riley's situation at Clearwater was deteriorating. The group home environment, while safe, wasn't equipped to support her artistic development or her specific needs as a trafficking survivor. Her roommate, a 17-year-old named Jessica, who had been in care since age 12, had developed a drug habit that was tolerated by staff as long as it didn't create visible problems. The facility's approach to trauma counseling consisted of weekly group sessions led by a rotating series of graduate students who were fulfilling internship requirements. Marcus began visiting Riley twice a week, working within the strict guidelines that governed contact between potential foster parents and children in state care. Their visits took place in Clearwater's family room, a space designed to facilitate supervised interactions between children and approved visitors. The room was decorated with cheerful posters and comfortable furniture, but the underlying institutional atmosphere made meaningful conversation difficult. During one visit, Riley showed Marcus a series of drawings she had been working on, detailed portraits of the other children who had been rescued from the warehouse. Each drawing captured not just physical appearance, but something essential about the person's character and experience. A 10-year-old boy was depicted with adult eyes that had seen too much. A 12-year-old girl was shown with her arms wrapped protectively around herself, even in sleep. "I want to remember them," Riley explained, using her foot to point out details in each portrait. Not the bad things that happened, but who they were underneath all of that. Everyone kept telling us we were damaged, but I could see that we were just kids who had been hurt. There's a difference. The insight revealed Riley's remarkable ability to distinguish between temporary circumstances and permanent identity, a skill that Marcus recognized as crucial for trauma recovery. She understood instinctively that survival and healing required holding on to core identity, even when external circumstances threatened to redefine everything about who you were. Marcus began bringing art supplies to their visits, specialized brushes that Riley could manipulate with her feet, high-quality paper that could withstand her unique technique, and paints that would allow her to explore color in ways that her previous limited resources hadn't permitted. Watching Riley create art was like witnessing magic, as she transformed raw materials into expressions of beauty and hope that seemed impossible given her physical constraints. The breakthrough in the placement process came from an unexpected source. Dr. Rachel Thompson, the pediatric emergency medicine specialist who had examined Riley immediately after her rescue, submitted a detailed medical report that specifically recommended Marcus as Riley's foster parent. Dr. Thompson's report cited research on trauma recovery, the importance of maintaining connections with rescue-related support systems, and the unique benefits of placement with someone who personally understood disability-related challenges. The report was accompanied by letters of support from Detective Morrison, who vouched for Marcus's character and competence based on their work together. Sandra Kim, the officer who had extracted Riley from the warehouse, wrote about the immediate bond she had observed between Marcus and Riley during their first meeting. Even Officer Jennifer Martinez from the shelter provided documentation about their remarkable rapport and Riley's expressed preference for placement with Marcus. But the most powerful advocate turned out to be Riley herself. During her required interview with the Placement Review Board, she presented her own case with the articulate passion of someone who understood exactly what she wanted and why she deserved to have it. She spoke about Marcus's unique qualifications to understand her needs, his demonstrated commitment to helping trafficking survivors, and her belief that they could create a family structure that worked for both of their disabilities. "Most people look at us and see what's missing," Riley had told the review board, according to Patricia Williams's notes. "But we look at each other and see what's possible. He needs someone who understands that being different doesn't mean being less than. I need someone who won't try to fix me because he knows I'm not broken. We're not looking for normal. We're looking for right." The bureaucratic machinery ground slowly forward, processing applications and conducting reviews with the methodical pace of institutions designed to minimize risk rather than maximize opportunity. But beneath the surface of forms and procedures, something unprecedented was taking shape, a placement that defied conventional wisdom, but made perfect sense to everyone who actually knew the people involved. 6 weeks after Marcus first walked into the Department of Human Services building, Patricia Williams called him with news that would change both his life and Riley's forever. The placement had been approved with conditions and requirements that reflected the unique nature of their situation. Marcus Thompson was officially authorized to provide foster care for Riley Chun, effective immediately. As he hung up the phone, Marcus realized that he was about to become something he had never expected to be, a father to a daughter who would teach him that families weren't created by biology or convention, but by the recognition that some people were meant to find each other and make each other whole. The key to apartment 4B at Riverside Gardens felt different in Marcus's hand on the day Riley moved in. Heavier somehow, weighted with the responsibility of creating a home for someone who had never really had one. He had spent the previous week transforming his bachelor space into something that could accommodate a teenage girl with unique needs and artistic aspirations. The changes were practical but also symbolic, evidence that his life was expanding beyond the narrow confines of survival and solitude. Riley's belongings fit into 2 garbage bags and a cardboard box, representing 15 years of life that had been repeatedly interrupted by placement changes, system failures, and circumstances beyond her control. Everything she owned could be moved in a single trip, but Marcus understood that the real work of moving would take much longer. Riley wasn't just changing addresses. She was learning to trust that this placement might be different from all the others. The first challenge was immediate and practical: Riley's sleeping arrangements. Marcus had assumed she would want privacy and independence, so he had cleared out his home office to create a bedroom for her. But when Riley saw the space, a small room with a single window and a door that closed, she immediately tensed with anxiety that she tried to hide behind polite appreciation. "It's very nice," Riley said, her voice carefully neutral as she examined the room Marcus had spent days preparing. He had installed lower light switches, arranged furniture to accommodate her unique way of navigating space, and even purchased art supplies that he had arranged on a desk modified for her foot-based techniques. But something was wrong, and Riley's body language told the story that her words weren't sharing. It wasn't until that first night, when Marcus heard movement in the hallway at 2 a.m., that he understood the problem. Riley was sitting in the living room, curled up on the couch with a blanket, staring out the window toward the courtyard where security lights cast reassuring pools of visibility. She had tried to sleep in the bedroom but found herself overwhelmed by the sensation of being enclosed, cut off from awareness of her surroundings. "Can't sleep?" Marcus asked gently, wheeling into the living room without turning on lights that might feel intrusive. Riley looked embarrassed at being discovered, as if her inability to use the carefully prepared bedroom was a personal failing, rather than a trauma response. "I'm sorry. I know you worked hard to fix up that room for me. I just ... I can't sleep when I can't see the exits." The explanation opened a conversation about trauma responses, hypervigilance, and the ways that trafficking survivors often struggled with enclosed spaces that felt like potential traps. Riley described her experiences during captivity, when locked rooms had meant danger and surveillance had meant survival. Her need to maintain visual contact with escape routes wasn't a preference. It was a psychological necessity developed through circumstances where awareness literally meant the difference between life and death. Marcus understood immediately. His own apartment had been arranged with similar considerations: clear sightlines to exits, positioning that allowed him to monitor approaches, furniture arranged to provide mobility options rather than aesthetic appeal. Military training and disability had taught him that safety often required environmental awareness that most people took for granted. They spent the rest of that night reconfiguring the living space to work for both of them. The couch became Riley's bed, positioned so she could see both the front door and the window. Marcus moved his own sleeping area to the living room as well, understanding that Riley's sense of security was tied to not being isolated from the household's primary occupant. The arrangement was unconventional, but it worked for their specific needs. The practical challenges of their living situation were complex but solvable with creativity and patience. Riley needed assistance with tasks that required fine motor control with hands, opening jars, manipulating small objects, certain types of food preparation. Marcus needed help with tasks that required mobility, reaching high shelves, carrying items while using his wheelchair, certain cleaning activities. Their combined limitations created a natural partnership, where each person's abilities compensated for the other's constraints. Cooking together became their first shared project, a daily activity that required cooperation and communication, while producing tangible results they could both enjoy. Riley had never learned to cook during her years in foster care, where meals were typically prepared by staff or delivered through institutional food services. Marcus had survived on frozen dinners and takeout since his injury, having given up on the effort required to prepare real meals for one person. Their first cooking attempt was pancakes, chosen because the recipe was simple and the tools required could be adapted for Riley's foot-based technique. Marcus handled ingredients that needed to be measured precisely, while Riley mixed the batter using a whisk held between her toes. The initial results were disasters: lumpy batter, burned pancakes, flour scattered across every surface in the kitchen. But they were disasters they created together, laughing at mistakes instead of seeing them as evidence of inadequacy. "We're like a cooking show for people who have no idea what they're doing," Riley observed, using her foot to flip a pancake that immediately folded in half and stuck to the spatula. Except our audience would be really confused about why the host is cooking with her feet. The comment led to a discussion about Riley's artistic technique and the way she had adapted traditional methods to work with her physical reality. Marcus was fascinated by her ability to manipulate brushes and pencils with precision that exceeded what many people achieved with their hands. Riley demonstrated by sketching Marcus's likeness while they waited for another batch of pancakes, capturing not just his appearance but something essential about his character in a few quick strokes. School enrollment became their next major project, requiring navigation of educational bureaucracy that was only slightly less complicated than the foster care system. Riley had been out of formal education for months, first due to trafficking and then due to the chaos of rescue and placement. Her academic records were scattered across multiple districts, and her artistic abilities weren't reflected in standardized test scores that failed to measure the kind of intelligence she possessed. Denver's Lincoln High School had experience with students who had experienced trauma and disruption, but they had never enrolled someone with Riley's specific combination of circumstances. Her disability required accommodations for note-taking, test-taking, and laboratory work. Her status as a trafficking survivor required sensitivity to certain triggers and topics. Her artistic abilities needed nurturing through advanced art classes that could challenge her unique talents. The solution came through the school's art teacher, Margaret Foster, who had been teaching for 30 years and had developed a reputation for working with students that other teachers found challenging. Mrs. Foster took one look at Riley's portfolio and immediately understood that she was dealing with exceptional talent that transcended conventional categories of artistic ability. "I've never seen anything like this," Mrs. Foster told Marcus during Riley's enrollment meeting, examining drawings that Riley had created using her feet. "The technical skill is remarkable, but it's the emotional depth that really sets her work apart. This isn't just adaptive technique. This is genuine artistic vision." Mrs. Foster arranged for Riley to be placed in advanced art classes typically reserved for seniors, while also ensuring she received support in core academic subjects where she needed to catch up on missed material. The school's occupational therapist worked with Riley to develop adaptive tools and techniques that would allow her to participate fully in all aspects of the curriculum. The social dynamics of high school presented different challenges. Riley's classmates were curious about her disability and her placement with Marcus, but they approached both topics with the sometimes cruel directness of teenagers who hadn't yet learned to filter their questions through social convention. Riley handled the attention with remarkable grace, answering personal questions when she chose to, and deflecting inappropriate inquiries with humor that diffused potential conflict. "Are you adopted?" one student asked during Riley's first week. "It's more like we adopted each other," Riley replied. "Sometimes families happen in ways that don't fit the usual categories." The response became Riley's standard explanation for their unconventional family structure, acknowledging that their relationship defied simple categorization, while asserting that it was legitimate and meaningful despite its unusual origins. Marcus was impressed by her ability to claim their connection without feeling the need to justify it to people who hadn't earned the right to understand their story. Home life settled into routines that worked for both of them. Mornings began with coffee for Marcus and hot chocolate for Riley, consumed while they reviewed their respective plans for the day. Evenings included homework time that often turned into collaborative projects, with Marcus helping Riley with math and science, while she helped him with creative writing assignments he had undertaken through his continued work with Second Chances. Apartment gradually filled with Riley's artwork, not just pieces she created as assignments, but personal projects that reflected her processing of trauma, her observations of their daily life, and her growing sense of security in their shared space. Marcus found himself looking forward to discovering what she had created each day, amazed by her ability to find beauty and meaning in experiences that could have been defined by their difficulties. Their relationship deepened through shared challenges that required them to depend on each other in ways that went beyond practical assistance. When Marcus experienced episodes of phantom pain that left him unable to function normally, Riley adapted their routines without making him feel helpless or burdensome. When Riley had nightmares related to her trafficking experience, Marcus provided presence and security without trying to fix things that couldn't be fixed through conventional solutions. "We're good at this," Riley observed one evening as they worked together to prepare dinner, Marcus handling the stovetop cooking while Riley prepared vegetables using techniques she had developed for manipulating knives with her feet. "Being family, we're actually good at it." The statement was delivered casually, but Marcus understood its significance. Riley had never experienced family stability, had never lived anywhere long enough to develop the comfortable rhythms of shared domestic life. Her recognition that they were good at being family represented a fundamental shift in how she understood her own capacity for lasting relationships. 3 months into their living arrangement, Marcus received a call from Patricia Williams requesting a home visit to assess Riley's adjustment and the success of the placement. The visit was routine, required by state regulations for all foster placements, but Marcus found himself nervous about official scrutiny of the life they had built together. Patricia's assessment was thorough, including private interviews with both Marcus and Riley, examination of the living space, and review of Riley's school performance and social adjustment. What she found exceeded every metric used to evaluate foster placement success. Riley's grades were excellent, her artistic development was remarkable, and her emotional stability had improved dramatically since moving in with Marcus. "This is the most successful unconventional placement I've seen in 20 years, Patricia told Marcus during her exit interview. "Whatever you two are doing, it's working. Riley has found something here that she's never had before, not just stability, but the chance to thrive." As Patricia left, Riley emerged from her room where she had been working on a new drawing while the evaluation was conducted. The piece she showed Marcus took his breath away, a detailed portrait of the two of them working together in their kitchen, but rendered in a style that transformed ordinary domestic activity into something that looked almost sacred. They were depicted not as broken people helping each other survive, but as whole people creating something beautiful together. "I wanted to capture what family looks like," Riley explained, using her foot to point out details in the composition. "Not the Hallmark card version, but the real thing. The version where people fit together because they understand each other, not because they're supposed to." Marcus realized that Riley had succeeded in creating more than just artwork. She had created a visual representation of what they had built together. A home where disability wasn't limitation but adaptation. where trauma was acknowledged but not defining, where family meant choosing to make each other stronger rather than settling for conventional definitions of normal. The knock on their apartment door came at 7:15 on a Tuesday evening, interrupting Riley's homework and Marcus's preparation for a second chance's presentation he was scheduled to give the following day. The sound was distinctive, not the casual rap of a neighbor or the authoritative pound of law enforcement, but something tentative yet persistent that immediately put both of them on alert. Through the peephole, Marcus saw a woman in her 40s, with graying hair and nervous eyes, holding what appeared to be official documents. She wore the kind of professional clothing that suggested government employment, and her posture conveyed the uncomfortable determination of someone delivering news that no one wanted to hear. "Mr. Thompson," the woman said when Marcus opened the door. "My name is Linda Chun. I'm Riley's biological mother, and I need to speak with both of you." The words hit the apartment like a flashbang grenade, creating the same disorienting shock that Marcus remembered from combat situations where everything changed in an instant. Riley, who had been working on a charcoal portrait at the kitchen table, went completely still, her foot frozen mid-stroke as if someone had paused her in time. Linda Chun looked nothing like Riley, different build, different facial structure, different energy entirely. Where Riley moved with purposeful grace despite her disability, Linda seemed uncomfortable in her own skin, constantly shifting weight and adjusting her clothing. Her eyes kept darting between Marcus and Riley as if she wasn't sure which one of them posed the greater threat to whatever plan had brought her to their door. "May I come in?" Linda asked, her voice carrying a slight accent that suggested English wasn't her first language. "I've driven from Sacramento, and I think we need to discuss Riley's future." Marcus looked back at Riley, who had turned in her chair to face the door but hadn't moved closer. Her expression was unreadable, displaying the kind of emotional neutrality that Marcus had learned to recognize as her response to situations that felt dangerous or unpredictable. They had never discussed what would happen if Riley's biological family ever tried to make contact, largely because it had seemed like an impossibly remote possibility. "Riley," Marcus said carefully, "this is your choice. You can decide if you want to talk to her, and you can decide what you're comfortable with." Riley studied her biological mother with the same intense attention she brought to her artwork, cataloging details and searching for information that might help her understand this unexpected development. Linda Chun had the weathered appearance of someone whose life had been harder than her years suggested, but she also wore expensive jewelry and carried a designer purse that hinted at recent financial improvement. "You can come in," Riley said. Finally, her voice steady but cool. "But I want to know why you're here and what you want." Linda entered the apartment with obvious discomfort, taking in the modified living space with its adaptive equipment and scattered art supplies. Her gaze lingered on Riley's artwork displayed on the walls, detailed drawings and paintings that demonstrated technical skill far beyond what might be expected from a 15-year-old, especially one with her physical constraints. "You've become quite accomplished," Linda said, gesturing toward a particularly complex landscape that Riley had completed the previous month. The comment sounded hollow, like someone trying to make conversation about a stranger's hobbies rather than expressing genuine maternal pride. "I've always been artistic," Riley replied, not acknowledging the compliment. "What brings you to Denver?" "Ms. Chun?" The formal address wasn't lost on Linda, who flinched slightly at being called by her surname, rather than any term that suggested familial connection. She settled into the chair that Marcus offered, arranging her purse and documents with nervous precision before beginning what was clearly a rehearsed explanation. "Riley, I know this is unexpected, and I know you have no reason to trust me or want to see me," Linda began. "But my circumstances have changed significantly since I made the decision to surrender you to care 15 years ago. I'm remarried now, to a man named David who has been very successful in real estate development. We have financial stability. a large house in a good neighborhood, and the resources to provide you with opportunities that might not be available in your current situation. Marcus felt his stomach tighten as he recognized the direction this conversation was heading. Linda wasn't making a social call or attempting to repair a damaged relationship with her daughter. She was making a pitch, presenting herself as a preferable alternative to Riley's current placement with someone she presumably viewed as inadequate. "I've spoken with family court attorneys," Linda continued, pulling documents from her purse. "Given that you're still a minor and I'm your biological parent, I have legal standing to petition for custody. I'm not here to take you away against your will, but I want you to understand that you have options beyond aging out of the foster system." Riley's response was immediate and sharp. "You mean options beyond the family I've chosen?" The question carried weight that Linda clearly hadn't anticipated. She looked around the apartment again, this time with more obvious skepticism about what Riley might consider family-worthy in their modest surroundings. "Riley, I understand you've developed an attachment to Mr. Thompson, and I'm sure he's been kind to you," Linda said with the condescending tone of someone explaining reality to a child. "But you deserve more than kindness. You deserve a real family, with resources and stability, and the ability to provide for your future in ways that a disabled veteran simply cannot." Marcus felt anger rising in his chest, but he forced himself to remain quiet. This conversation needed to happen between Riley and her biological mother, without his own emotions clouding Riley's ability to process what was being offered and what it might cost. Riley stood up from her chair and moved to the window, looking out at the courtyard where children from the apartment complex were playing despite the cool evening air. When she spoke, her voice carried a maturity that made her sound far older than 15. "Tell me about the day you left me at the hospital," Riley said, without turning around. "Tell me what you were thinking when you looked at your 3-day-old daughter and decided she wasn't worth keeping." The question was delivered without anger or accusation, but it created a silence that filled the apartment like smoke. Linda's carefully prepared presentation about financial resources and future opportunities suddenly seemed irrelevant compared to the fundamental issue of how she had responded to Riley's disability 15 years earlier. "Riley, you have to understand," Linda said, her voice becoming defensive. "Your father and I were teenagers. We had no money, no support, no way to care for a child with special needs. We thought we were giving you a chance at a better life with people who could provide what you needed." "What I needed was parents who saw me as worth keeping," Riley replied, still facing the window. "What I needed was people who looked at me and saw possibilities instead of problems. What I needed was a family that wouldn't abandon me the moment things got difficult." The words hung in the air like an indictment, exposing the fundamental flaw in Linda's current offer. She was presenting herself as the solution to Riley's problems, but she was also the source of Riley's original trauma, the first person to decide that Riley's disability made her unworthy of love and commitment. Marcus found himself thinking about the conversations he and Riley had shared about family, disability, and the difference between being wanted and being tolerated. Riley had expressed her belief that real family meant choosing to love someone not despite their differences, but because of the unique person those differences helped create. "I was young and scared," Linda continued, her voice becoming more emotional. "I made decisions that I regret now, but I can't change the past. What I can do is offer you a future that includes college tuition, travel opportunities, connections that could advance your artistic career. David has contacts in the art world who could help you get your work seen by the right people." Riley turned from the window to face her biological mother directly. "And what would I have to give up for all of these opportunities?" "Give up?" Linda looked confused by the question. "You wouldn't be giving up anything. You'd be gaining a real family, financial security, a future with unlimited possibilities." "I'd be giving up the family I already have," Riley said simply. "I'd be giving up the person who rescued me from trafficking and then rescued me again." from the foster system. I'd be giving up living with someone who understands what it's like to be different, and who sees my disability as something that makes me stronger, rather than something that makes me less. The conversation continued for another hour, with Linda presenting increasingly elaborate descriptions of the life she could provide, and Riley asking increasingly pointed questions about motivations, commitment, and what would happen if her circumstances changed again. Marcus observed the interaction with growing admiration for Riley's ability to cut through emotional manipulation and focus on substantive issues. The turning point came when Riley asked Linda to explain her remarriage and her husband's attitude towards suddenly acquiring a disabled stepdaughter. Linda's answer revealed that David knew about Riley's existence, but had never expressed any interest in meeting her, viewing her inclusion in their family as Linda's personal project rather than a shared commitment. So David is willing to tolerate having me around because he loves you and you want me there, Riley summarized. But he's not actually interested in having a daughter, especially one who would require accommodations and understanding that he's never had to provide before. Linda's inability to convincingly deny this assessment effectively ended the discussion. Riley thanked her biological mother for the visit and for the offer, but declined to consider leaving her current placement. She explained that she had found something in her relationship with Marcus that she had never experienced before: the security of being valued for who she was, rather than tolerated despite who she was. "I hope you understand," Riley said as Linda prepared to leave, "that I'm not rejecting you because I'm angry about the past. I'm choosing to stay here because I've learned the difference between being wanted and being accepted, and I deserve to be wanted." After Linda left, Marcus and Riley sat in their living room processing what had just occurred. The visit had forced them to articulate what their relationship meant to each other, and why it was worth protecting against challenges from people who couldn't understand its value. "Are you okay?" Marcus asked, recognizing that the encounter had required enormous emotional strength from Riley. "I'm better than okay," Riley replied. "I finally got to tell someone from my biological family that they were wrong about me, that I wasn't broken or burdensome or impossible to love. That was worth having that conversation." Riley picked up her sketchpad and began working on a new drawing, using quick strokes to capture the emotions of the evening. The image that emerged showed two figures standing together in front of a closed door, not as people being shut out, but as people who had chosen not to enter because they had found something better where they were. "We're really good at being family," Riley said, echoing her observation from months earlier. "And now I know that what we have is strong enough to survive people who don't understand it." Marcus realized that Linda's visit, intended to disrupt their relationship, had actually strengthened it by forcing them to clearly define what they meant to each other and why their unconventional family structure was worth defending against more traditional alternatives that couldn't offer what they had found together. 6 months after Linda Chun's failed custody attempt, Riley's art teacher Margaret Foster approached her with an opportunity that would test everything she and Marcus had built together. The Denver Art Museum was hosting their annual Emerging Voices exhibition, a prestigious showcase that had launched several young artists into national recognition. Mrs. Foster believed Riley's work was ready for that level of exposure, but the application process would require something neither of them had anticipated: public disclosure of Riley's story. "Riley," Mrs. Foster had said after class one Friday afternoon, "I've been following your development this year, and I think you're ready for something big. But I need to be honest about what it would involve." The exhibition required artists to submit not just artwork, but personal statements explaining the inspiration and technique behind their pieces. For Riley, that would mean revealing her disability, her trafficking experience, and her unconventional family situation with Marcus. The art world, Mrs. Foster explained, was particularly interested in stories of overcoming adversity, but that interest came with the cost of public scrutiny and media attention. Riley had been creating a new series of paintings she called Reconstruction. Large-scale works that depicted the process of building identity after trauma. The pieces were technically brilliant, using techniques she had developed for manipulating multiple brushes, simultaneously with her feet to create layered textures that traditional hand-based methods couldn't achieve. But more than technical. Innovation. The paintings captured something universal about the human experience of resilience and transformation. The centerpiece of the series was a painting titled Assembly Required, which showed two figures working together to build something that looked like a house but felt like a metaphor for family. One figure was seated, the other standing, but their combined efforts created something whole and beautiful despite the obvious challenges they faced. The composition was complex enough to reward extended viewing, but the emotional message was immediately clear. Some of the most beautiful things in life were built by people who had learned to work with what they had rather than lamenting what they lacked. Marcus encouraged Riley to apply for the exhibition, understanding that her art deserved recognition beyond the confines of high school art shows and local coffee shop displays. But he also worried about exposing their private story to public judgment from people who might not understand the legitimacy of their relationship or the validity of their family structure. What if people think I'm taking advantage of you? Marcus asked during one of their evening conversations about the opportunity. What if they decide that our situation is inappropriate and try to get you removed from my care? Riley considered his concerns seriously before responding. What if they see our story and understand that family can happen in ways they never imagined? What if some other kid in foster care sees that they don't have to settle for people who just tolerate them? What if some other disabled person realizes that their differences can be sources of strength instead of limitations? The application process took weeks of careful preparation. Riley wrote and rewrote her artist statement dozens of times, trying to capture the essence of her experience without sensationalizing the trauma or oversimplifying the complexity of her relationship with Marcus. She wanted to tell a story that honored the pain of her past while celebrating the hope of her present, that acknowledged her disability without making it the central focus of her identity. Marcus found himself playing an unexpected role in the process, helping Riley research other artists who had gained recognition despite or because of their unconventional circumstances. They discovered painters who worked with their mouths due to paralysis, sculptors who created magnificent works despite blindness, artists whose physical limitations had led to innovative techniques that expanded the possibilities of their mediums. We're not the only ones who figured out that different doesn't mean less than. Riley observed while studying the work of Joni Eareckson Tada, a quadriplegic artist who painted by holding brushes in her mouth. Maybe the art world is ready for stories about people who've learned to create beauty with whatever tools they have. The submission deadline arrived with a mixture of anticipation and anxiety that filled their apartment like electricity before a storm. Riley's portfolio included 12 paintings from her Reconstruction series, each accompanied by detailed descriptions of her foot-based technique and the emotional journey the artwork represented. Her artist statement was a masterpiece of its own, honest about her experiences while maintaining dignity, specific about her methods while remaining accessible to general audiences. 3 months later, Mrs. Foster called Riley out of chemistry class with news that would change both their lives forever. Riley had been selected as one of 12 artists for the Emerging Voices exhibition, making her the youngest participant in the program's 15-year history. The recognition came with a $10,000 scholarship, mentorship opportunities with established artists, and exhibition space in one of Denver's most prestigious cultural venues. The phone call to Marcus came immediately after Riley returned to class, her voice breathless with excitement and disbelief. They chose me. They actually chose me. Mrs. Foster says the selection committee was unanimous. They've never seen technique like mine, and they think my story will inspire other young artists facing challenges. Marcus felt pride swelling in his chest like a physical force. Recognition that the girl he had rescued from trafficking had become someone whose talent demanded acknowledgement from the art establishment. But beneath the pride was anxiety about what public recognition would mean for their carefully constructed private life. The exhibition opening was scheduled for a Friday evening in early spring, with an expected attendance of several hundred people, including art critics, collectors, education officials, and media representatives. Riley would be required to attend, to speak about her work, and to be available for interviews with journalists covering the event. The prospect of public speaking about her personal experiences terrified and excited her. In equal measure, preparation for the opening became a family project that consumed their evenings for weeks. Marcus helped Riley practice talking about her artwork without becoming overwhelmed by memories of trauma. They developed strategies for handling inappropriate questions, for maintaining boundaries while still sharing her story authentically, for presenting their relationship in ways that emphasized its legitimacy without defensiveness. Remember, Marcus coached her during one of their practice sessions, "You don't owe anyone explanations about our family. You can choose what to share and what to keep private. The most important thing is that you feel proud of what you've accomplished and confident about what you have to say." Riley's confidence grew through the preparation process, and Marcus watched her transform from someone who had learned to make herself invisible into someone ready to step into spotlights and claim recognition for her achievements. The change wasn't just about the exhibition. It was about Riley finally understanding that her story was valuable, that her experiences had created wisdom and strength that others could learn from. The week before the opening, a local television station requested an interview with Riley about her upcoming exhibition debut. The reporter, Jennifer Martinez from Channel 7 News, had covered the Emerging Voices program for several years and was particularly interested in Riley's story as the youngest artist ever selected and the first to work exclusively with foot-based techniques. The interview took place in their apartment, with Riley demonstrating her painting technique while discussing her background and artistic development. Marcus participated minimally, allowing Riley to tell their story in her own words, while providing support through his presence rather than his voice. "Riley," Jennifer had asked, "can you describe what it was like to develop your artistic abilities despite your physical differences?" "I think that's the wrong question," Riley replied with the directness that Marcus had learned to admire. "It wasn't despite my differences, it was because of them. My feet are more sensitive and precise than most people's hands because I've spent 15 years training them to do things feet aren't supposed to do. My disability didn't limit my art. It created possibilities that wouldn't exist otherwise." The interview aired the evening before the exhibition opening, introducing Riley's story to a television audience that responded with overwhelming support. The station's social media posts about Riley's segment received hundreds of comments from viewers expressing admiration for her talent and her attitude toward disability. Several art teachers shared the story with their students, and multiple disability advocacy organizations requested permission to use Riley's example in their educational materials. On the morning of the exhibition opening, Marcus woke to find Riley already awake, sitting by the window and working on a small sketch that she often created when processing strong emotions. The drawing showed two figures standing before a large audience, but instead of looking nervous or overwhelmed, they appeared confident and proud, ready to share something beautiful with the world. "Are you ready for this?" Marcus asked, joining her by the window. "I think I've been ready my whole life," Riley replied. "I just didn't know what I was getting ready for until now." The exhibition opening would prove to be more than just recognition for Riley's artistic talent. It would become the moment when their story reached people who needed to hear it, other trafficking survivors who thought recovery was impossible, disabled individuals who had been told their limitations to find their potential, foster children who believed they would never find families that truly wanted them. But as they prepared to leave for the museum, Marcus and Riley weren't thinking about the broader impact their story might have. They were thinking about how far they had traveled together from that warehouse where they first met, how much they had built from the broken pieces of their individual pasts, and how ready they were to show the world what family looked like. When it was chosen rather than assigned, when it was based on mutual understanding rather than conventional expectations, the art that had begun as Riley's personal method of processing trauma had become something larger, a bridge between their private healing and public inspiration, a way of transforming their individual story into something that could help others understand that wholeness came not from having all the expected pieces, but from learning to create beauty with whatever pieces remained. The Denver Art Museum's atrium buzzed with the sophisticated energy of opening night as Marcus and Riley arrived for the Emerging Voices exhibition. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over elegantly dressed patrons who moved between wine stations and artwork displays with the practiced ease of people comfortable in cultural spaces. Riley wore a black dress that she had chosen specifically because it allowed her to demonstrate her painting technique if requested, while Marcus had traded his usual casual wear for a suit that made him feel like he was wearing someone else's uniform. The first thing that struck them was the sheer scale of the exhibition. Riley's 12 paintings from the Reconstruction series were displayed in a dedicated gallery space, with professional lighting that revealed textures and details that had been invisible in their apartment. Assembly required. The centerpiece painting, depicting two figures building something beautiful together, commanded the center wall with a presence that made viewers stop mid-conversation to study its layers of meaning. Dr. Catherine Williams, the museum's curator of contemporary art, approached them with the warm professionalism of someone who had spent decades helping artists navigate their first major exhibitions. She was a woman in her 60s with silver hair and sharp eyes that seemed to catalog every detail, while maintaining genuine warmth toward the people she worked with. Riley, Dr. Williams said, extending her hand before realizing the gesture was impossible and smoothly transitioning to a welcoming smile. Your work is absolutely extraordinary. We've had 3 collectors inquire about purchasing pieces before the exhibition even officially opened. The news that people wanted to buy. Her paintings created a rush of emotion that Riley struggled to process. For someone who had been labeled damaged goods just over a year earlier, the idea that her artwork was valuable enough for strangers to purchase felt like validation of everything she had worked to overcome. The evening's formal program began with remarks from museum officials and previous Emerging Voices participants who had gone on to establish successful artistic careers. Riley was scheduled to speak last, after the audience had had time to view the exhibitions and understand the context for her presentation. Marcus positioned himself where Riley could see him easily, understanding that his presence provided her with emotional anchoring in a situation that could otherwise feel overwhelming. Dr. Williams introduced Riley with a speech that managed to acknowledge her unusual circumstances without sensationalizing them. She spoke about the technical innovation of Riley's foot-based painting techniques, the emotional depth of her Reconstruction series, and the way her work expanded conventional understanding of what artistic creation could look like. Tonight, Dr. Williams concluded, we're privileged to hear from an artist who reminds us that some of the most powerful art emerges from the deepest challenges, and that creativity finds ways to flourish regardless of the tools available to express it. Riley approached the podium with steady steps, her head held high despite the sea of faces looking back at her. She had practiced this speech dozens of times, but standing before an audience of art professionals, critics, and collectors felt different from rehearsing in their apartment. The weight of representing not just herself but other disabled artists, trafficking survivors, and unconventional families settled on her shoulders. 2 years ago, Riley began, her voice carrying clearly through the gallery space. I was living in a warehouse where people like me were bought and sold like inventory. The man who purchased me from my captors is sitting in this audience tonight. And I want to start by saying that the best thing that ever happened to me was being bought by someone who saw me as priceless rather than worthless. The opening lines immediately shifted the energy in the room from polite cultural appreciation to rapt attention. Riley had chosen to lead with the most challenging aspect of her story, establishing from the beginning that her art couldn't be separated from her experiences of trauma and recovery. She continued by describing how art had served as both survival mechanism and healing tool throughout her journey from trafficking victim to recognized artist. She explained her foot-based techniques not as adaptations necessitated by disability, but as innovations that had opened creative possibilities unavailable to traditional hand-based approaches. "When people see my paintings," Riley said, gesturing toward assembly required behind her, "they often focus on how I created them, despite not having arms. But I want to suggest a different perspective. These paintings exist because I don't have arms, not in spite of that fact. My disability didn't limit my artistic vision. It expanded the ways that vision could be expressed." The speech continued with Riley discussing the themes of reconstruction and transformation that ran through her work. She spoke about the difference between being broken and being remade, about finding beauty in unconventional configurations, about the strength that could emerge from learning to work with whatever tools were available. "Art has taught me that wholeness isn't about having all the expected pieces," she said, making eye contact with Marcus across the room. "Wholeness is about understanding how the pieces you have can create something beautiful when they're arranged with intention and love." The audience's response was immediate and overwhelming. The applause continued for nearly 2 minutes, with several people wiping away tears as they rose to give Riley a standing ovation. Dr. Williams had to gesture for quiet before opening the floor for questions, which came rapidly from critics, collectors, and other artists eager to understand more about Riley's techniques and philosophy. The questions ranged from technical inquiries about her painting methods to more personal queries about her journey from trafficking to artistic recognition. Riley handled each with the poise of someone who had learned to share her story without being consumed by it, offering enough detail to satisfy curiosity while maintaining appropriate boundaries around the most traumatic aspects of her experience. One question came from a young woman who identified herself as a recent graduate from the Rocky Mountain College of Art and Design. "Riley, what advice would you give to other artists who feel like their physical differences make them less qualified for success in the art world?" Riley's answer would later be quoted in multiple art publications and disability rights websites. "I would tell them that the art world doesn't need more people who can do the same things in the same ways," she said. "What it needs is people who can show us possibilities we never imagined. Your differences aren't obstacles to overcome. They're resources to explore." As the formal program concluded and guests began circulating through the gallery spaces, Marcus found himself approached by numerous attendees who wanted to understand more about his role in Riley's story. Some were social workers interested in learning about successful foster placements. Others were veterans curious about his transition from military service to civilian advocacy work. The most meaningful conversation came with Dr. James Rodriguez, a psychiatrist who specialized in treating trafficking survivors. He had attended the exhibition after reading about Riley's story in the newspaper and wanted to discuss the therapeutic implications of her artistic practice. "What you and Riley have accomplished together challenges everything we think we know about trauma recovery," Dr. Rodriguez told Marcus. "The traditional model focuses on individual healing in controlled therapeutic environments. But Riley's recovery seems to have happened through relationship, through creative expression, and through finding purpose in helping others understand their own potential." The observation made Marcus realize that their story had implications beyond their personal healing. Riley's artistic success was evidence that trauma survivors could not only recover, but could use their experiences to create something valuable for the broader community. Their unconventional family structure had provided the stability necessary for that transformation to occur. Throughout the evening, Marcus watched Riley interact with art critics, collectors, and fellow artists with growing amazement at her confidence and authenticity. She discussed technical aspects of her work with professors, shared personal insights with other young artists, and graciously accepted praise while remaining grounded in her understanding of how far she had traveled to reach this moment. Evening's most surprising development came when Rebecca Martinez, a representative from the Colorado Council on the Arts, approached Riley with an unexpected proposal. The State Arts Council was developing a new program called Art Beyond Barriers, designed to provide resources and opportunities for disabled artists throughout Colorado. They wanted Riley to serve as the program's first youth ambassador, a role that would involve traveling to schools and community centers to demonstrate that disability could be a source of creative innovation rather than limitation. "We've been looking for someone who could represent the program authentically," Rebecca explained. "Someone whose artistic achievement speaks for itself, but who also understands the challenges that disabled artists face in gaining recognition and support." The offer represented another level of public engagement that would require Riley to share her story with even broader audiences. But it also offered the opportunity to directly impact other young people who might be struggling with their own physical differences or traumatic experiences. Riley asked for time to consider the proposal, wanting to discuss with Marcus how this new role might affect their family life and her educational goals. The conversation would happen later, but Marcus could already see in Riley's expression that she was intrigued by the possibility of using her platform to help others. As the evening wound down and guests began departing, Riley and Marcus found themselves alone in the gallery with her paintings. The formal presentations were over, the critics had filed their reviews, and the social obligations had been fulfilled. What remained was the quiet satisfaction of having shared their story authentically and having it received with respect and admiration. "How do you feel?" Marcus asked, settling his wheelchair beside the bench where Riley was sitting. "Like we just proved something important," Riley replied, studying assembly required in the museum lighting. "Like we showed people that broken things can become beautiful when they're put back together by people who understand what wholeness really means." The exhibition would run for 3 months, during which time Riley's paintings would be viewed by thousands of visitors. Art critics would write reviews praising her technical innovation and emotional depth. Collectors would purchase several pieces, providing Riley with financial resources for her future education. Educational institutions would invite her to speak about art, disability, and resilience. But on this night, as they sat in the gallery surrounded by artwork that told the story of their journey together, Marcus and Riley were simply a father and daughter who had found each other in the darkest of circumstances and had created something beautiful from the broken pieces of their individual pasts. The recognition was gratifying, but the relationship that had made it possible was the real masterpiece they had created together. The museum's security guard approached them respectfully, indicating that the building would be closing soon. As they prepared to leave, Riley took one last look at her paintings displayed in professional gallery lighting, understanding that this exhibition marked not an ending but a transformation. Their private story of healing had become a public source of inspiration, and their unconventional family had proven that love could transcend every conventional boundary society tried to impose. 2 years after the exhibition that launched Riley's artistic career, Marcus Thompson stood in the kitchen of their new house in Denver's Park Hill neighborhood, watching his 18-year-old daughter prepare breakfast with the efficient grace of someone who had turned adaptation into art. The morning sunlight streamed through windows that overlooked a garden Riley had designed and planted herself, using techniques she had developed for landscape creation that worked with her physical capabilities rather than against them. The house itself was a testament to how far they had traveled together, since those early days in the cramped apartment at Riverside Gardens. Rayleigh's art sales had provided the down payment, while Marcus's promotion to regional coordinator for Second Chances had made the mortgage payments manageable. But more than financial improvement, the house represented their evolution from survival mode to purposeful living, from making do with what they had to creating exactly what they wanted. Riley's acceptance letter to the Rhode Island School of Design lay open on the kitchen counter, surrounded by similar offers from art schools across the country. Each institution had not only offered full scholarships, but had competed to attract someone whose innovative techniques and inspiring story had already begun reshaping conversations about disability and artistic expression. The decision of where to attend college represented the kind of problem that Riley had never imagined having: too many excellent opportunities rather than too few. "I've been thinking about the RISD offer," Riley said, using her foot to flip pancakes with the precision of a professional chef. "The adaptive arts program they're developing sounds incredible, and working with Dr. Martinez on the research project could really help other disabled artists." Marcus nodded, understanding that Riley's decision would be based on more than just personal advancement. Over the past 2 years, she had become increasingly committed to using her platform to advocate for other disabled artists and trafficking survivors. Her role as youth ambassador for the Colorado Council on the Arts had evolved into speaking engagements across the country, consulting work with museums developing accessibility programs, and mentorship relationships with young artists who needed to see that their differences could be sources of strength. That the transformation in Riley was remarkable to witness, but perhaps more significant was the transformation in Marcus himself. The broken veteran who had once struggled to find purpose beyond survival had become someone whose work with Second Chances was making national impact. His collaboration with law enforcement agencies had helped rescue hundreds of trafficking victims, while his advocacy for unconventional foster placements had influenced policy changes in multiple states. Their relationship had evolved too, from the careful mutual dependency of their early days to the confident interdependence of people who had chosen to build something beautiful together. They were no longer just a disabled veteran and a trafficking survivor helping each other survive. They were a father and daughter who had discovered that love could transcend every boundary that society tried to impose on what families were supposed to look like. The doorbell interrupted their breakfast preparation, announcing the arrival of Detective Angela Morrison and a young man whom Marcus immediately recognized as someone carrying the particular weight of recent trauma. Detective Morrison had called the previous evening to ask if they could meet with David Kim, a 17-year-old trafficking survivor who had been rescued 3 weeks earlier and was struggling with the transition to freedom. "David," Detective Morrison said after introductions were made, "I wanted you to meet Marcus and Riley because their story might help you understand that recovery is possible, even when it feels impossible." David Kim was thin in the way that spoke of prolonged malnutrition, with eyes that held the hyper-vigilant awareness Marcus remembered from his own early days after rescue. He examined their house with the careful attention of someone cataloging exit routes and potential threats, a survival skill that would take time to unlearn. When he spoke, his voice carried the cautious politeness of someone who had learned that saying the wrong thing could have dangerous consequences. "Detective Morrison said you were both trafficked," David said, looking at Riley with curiosity mixed with skepticism. "But this doesn't look like any group home I've ever seen." Riley smiled with the gentle understanding of someone who remembered her own disbelief when she first encountered the possibility of safety and stability. "It's not a group home. It's our house. Marcus adopted me officially last year, though. He's been my dad in every way that matters since the day he rescued me." The conversation that followed lasted 3 hours, with David gradually relaxing as Riley and Marcus shared their story without trying to minimize the ongoing challenges of recovery or oversimplify the process of building trust after betrayal. They talked about nightmares that still occasionally disrupted sleep, about hypervigilance that made crowded spaces difficult, about the ongoing work of distinguishing between rational caution and trauma-induced fear. But they also talked about the unexpected gifts that had emerged from their darkest experiences. Marcus's understanding of survival and adaptation had made him exceptionally qualified to help other trauma survivors. Riley's artistic abilities had been refined by years of finding creative solutions to physical challenges. Their relationship had been strengthened by the recognition that they had chosen each other during the worst circumstances of their lives and had continued choosing each other as those circumstances improved. The thing about trauma, Riley explained to David while demonstrating her painting technique on a small canvas, is that it changes you permanently. But change doesn't have to mean damage. Sometimes it means developing capabilities you never would have discovered if your life had been easy. David watched Riley create a detailed landscape using brushes held between her toes, his expression shifting from polite attention to genuine amazement as he realized the technical skill required for her artistic method. When she finished the piece and handed it to him as a gift, his carefully maintained emotional control finally cracked. "I don't understand how you can be so ... normal," David said, tears streaming down his face. "How you can live in a house like this and have a family and make art that people want to buy. How do you stop feeling like something terrible is always about to happen?" Marcus answered with the hard-earned wisdom of someone who had learned to distinguish between healing and being healed. You don't stop feeling that way completely, but you learn to recognize the difference between actual danger and trauma memories. You build relationships with people who prove over time that they're safe, and you find purposes that are bigger than your fear. Riley added her own perspective with characteristic directness. "And you remember that the people who hurt you were wrong about who you are. They saw you as something to be used and discarded, but that was never true. You're someone worth knowing, worth loving, worth investing in. The hard part is learning to believe that about yourself." Before David left, Marcus provided him with contact information for counselors who specialized in trafficking recovery, educational advocates who could help him complete his high school education, and art therapists who might help him explore creative expression as a healing tool. But more importantly, they had given him something he hadn't had before: visual proof that life after trafficking could include not just survival but genuine happiness and meaningful accomplishment. That evening, as Riley worked on her latest painting series called Forward Motion, pieces that depicted various forms of movement and progress, Marcus reflected on how their story had expanded beyond their personal healing to impact others who needed to see that recovery was possible. Riley's art was now displayed in galleries across the country. Her techniques were being taught in adaptive arts programs, and her story was inspiring other trafficking survivors to believe in their own potential for transformation. The painting Riley was working on that night showed two figures walking together down a path that stretched toward a horizon filled with light. The figures were clearly moving forward, but they weren't abandoning their past. They were carrying it with them as something that had shaped them without defining them. The technique was flawless, but the emotional content was what made the piece extraordinary. "What are you thinking about for the title?" Marcus asked, observing the painting from his position across the studio space they had created in what used to be the dining room. "I'm thinking chosen family," Riley replied, adding final details to the figures' faces. "Because that's what we are, not people who ended up together by accident, but people who looked at each other and decided we wanted to build something beautiful together." The phrase captured something essential about their relationship that Marcus had struggled to articulate. They weren't just a foster father and daughter, weren't just two disabled people helping each other cope, weren't just a veteran and a trafficking survivor who had formed an alliance for mutual benefit. They were a family in the deepest sense of the word, people who had chosen to love each other unconditionally, to support each other's growth, and to create something together that was stronger than either of them could be alone. 3 months later, Rayleigh's high school graduation ceremony took place on a warm June evening that felt like a celebration of everything they had overcome together. Mrs. Foster, who had become not just Riley's teacher but a family friend, spoke about Riley's artistic achievements and her impact on other students who had learned from her example that differences could be sources of strength rather than limitations. Riley's valedictorian speech focused on the theme of reconstruction, not just rebuilding after trauma, but building something entirely new from the pieces that remained. She spoke about the classmates who had taught her that belonging was possible, the teachers who had challenged her to exceed her own expectations, and the family that had shown her that love could transcend every conventional boundary. 4 years ago, Riley concluded, I was someone that other people saw as broken beyond repair. Today, I'm someone who knows that wholeness isn't about having all the expected pieces. It's about understanding how the pieces you have can create something beautiful when they're arranged with intention and love. As Riley accepted her diploma and the standing ovation that followed, Marcus felt the familiar surge of pride that had become one of the defining emotions of their relationship. But beneath the pride was something deeper, the recognition that they had succeeded in creating exactly what they had set out to build when they first decided to become a family. That night, as they celebrated at home with a dinner that Riley had cooked and Marcus had helped prepare, they talked about the future with the confident excitement of people who had learned to trust that good things were possible. Riley would attend art school in the fall, where she would develop new techniques and explore new themes while continuing her advocacy work. Marcus would expand his role with second chances, potentially opening a regional office that could help more trafficking survivors access the resources they needed for recovery. But beyond their individual goals, they had plans for their continued life together as a family. Holiday traditions they wanted to establish, travel destinations they wanted to explore, ways they could continue supporting other people who needed to see that healing was possible. They had learned that family wasn't something you were born into or assigned to. It was something you created through daily choices to love, support, and believe in each other. As the evening wound down and they prepared for bed in their respective rooms, Riley in the space she had designed to accommodate her artistic work, Marcus in the adapted bedroom that provided the accessibility features he needed, they shared the quiet satisfaction of people who had not only survived their worst experiences, but had transformed them into sources of strength and purpose. Marcus, Riley said as they said goodnight, using the name she had eventually chosen for him over Dad, though the love was identical regardless of terminology. Thank you for seeing me as worth saving. Thank you for teaching me what wholeness really means, Marcus replied, understanding that their gratitude was mutual and ongoing. In the darkness of their home, surrounded by Riley's artwork and the physical evidence of the life they had built together, Marcus Thompson and Riley Chun rested in the security of knowing they had found what every human being searches for, the recognition that they were valued, loved, and seen as complete, exactly as they were. Their story had begun in a warehouse where broken people were bought and sold like merchandise. It had become a testament to the truth that wholeness was never about having all the expected pieces, but about learning to create something beautiful with whatever pieces remained. Together, they had discovered that a war veteran with no legs and a girl with no arms could indeed become whole again, not by replacing what they had lost, but by understanding that their combined strengths were greater than the sum of their individual limitations. In the end, they had given each other the greatest gift possible, the knowledge that they were loved not in spite of their differences, but because of the unique people those differences had helped them become. They were living proof that families could be created by choice rather than biology, that healing could happen through relationship rather than isolation, and that some of the most beautiful things in life were built by people who had learned to work with what they had rather than lamenting what they lacked. Their story was no longer one of trauma and survival, but of transformation and hope. And in a world that often forgot to see the value in broken things, Marcus and Riley had become living reminders that wholeness came not from perfection, but from the courage to love and be loved exactly as you are. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.